The US has so far killed 83 people in 21 strikes on boats off the coast of Venezuela since September in so-called counter-narcotics operations. It looks like none of the victims were carrying narcotics, which can only mean one thing: they haven't done enough strikes. And now President Trump has declared Venezuela's airspace closed and signaled that a ground invasion is imminent. Venezuela isn't a major route for drugs trafficked into the US, so what's the real motive for this war? How could it play out? And what on earth is happening to Venezuelan government bonds? Today, we find out. My name's Nick, and you're watching Coin Bureau Finance. Before we get into it, nothing in this video is financial advice. Today, we're sharing everything we know about the escalating situation with Venezuela and what it could mean for the markets and the world. And if you find our videos useful, smash that like button and let's dig in. It's the largest US naval deployment to the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis. 12 warships, including the USS Gerald R. Ford, America's newest and most expensive aircraft carrier, plus over 14,000 troops, fighter jets, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, and a special operations vessel are now parked off the coast of Venezuela. In early November, the U.S. Southern Command activated the Joint Task Force Southern Spear, led by the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. The task force includes the same Special Operations Regiment who flew the Bin Laden raid, plus amphibious units designed for ship-to-shore operations. The official mission is counter-narcotics. That would be the same mission that the Coast Guard handles every day, with patrol aircraft and cutters, vessels that are many times smaller. But for some reason, Washington has decided that intercepting speedboats now requires FA-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare jets, and Ashley Burke destroyers carrying Tomahawk cruise missiles that can hit targets 1,000 miles inland. Coincidentally, this is also the configuration that would be ideal for fighting the Venezuelan military. Venezuela operates Su-30 fighters and S-300 air defense systems, decent hardware by regional standards. But the Ford's air wing carries more combat aircraft than the entire Venezuelan Air Force. The Growlers exist specifically to jam the kind of radar systems the S-300 uses. And this force could establish air superiority over the country in a matter of hours. Military planners call this kind of force package theater-level capability. It's what you assemble when you're preparing to compel a government to do something, or to remove one entirely. It's not what you need to chase suspected drug runners who aren't carrying any drugs. And yet, the next phase is already being telegraphed. On Thanksgiving, Trump told troops that stopping drugs by sea was going very well. Quote, "People aren't wanting to be delivering by sea anymore." And that the next step was coming. Quote, "We'll be starting to stop them by land also. The land is easier, but that's going to start very soon." 2 days later, he posted on Truth Social that the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela should be considered, quote, "closed in its entirety." He addressed the message to all airlines, pilots, drug dealers, and human traffickers. One of those groups is not like the others. Anyways, commercial airlines had already got the message, as 6 of them had already cancelled their flights to Venezuela. Now, airlines don't just pull out of destinations randomly. When they do, it's usually because someone at Lloyd's of London has done the maths and decided that the risk isn't worth insuring. Now, Lloyd's actually has a joint war committee that maintains a list of high-risk areas. And once a region makes that list, insurance premiums for hull and liability go through the roof. We're talking multiples of the normal rates. At a certain point, flying these routes becomes economically unviable. Airlines don't need to be told there's a war coming. The insurance market tells them in advance. And this is why flight cancellations are one of the most reliable leading indicators of imminent military conflict. In the days before Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, commercial carriers started pulling out of Ukrainian airspace, not because of any official announcement, but because the insurers had already priced in what was about to happen. The 6 carriers who stopped flying to Venezuela did so after the FAA issued warnings to exercise caution in Venezuelan airspace due to, quote, heightened military activity. Venezuela did not appreciate this and revoked their operating rights, accusing them of participating in, quote, acts of state terrorism promoted by the US. So, now we have the US president unilaterally declaring another country's airspace closed via social media, and a US government agency warning commercial airlines to stay away due to its own military's encroachment upon that country, and commercial airlines obliging. And there's a term for all of this, and it's called clearing the battle space. In principle, at least, you're supposed to get civilian traffic out of the way before the shooting starts. For the shooting to continue under the counter-narcotics banner, though, Washington needs a legal framework. Enter narco-terrorism. In 2020, the US Department of Justice indicted President Nicolas Maduro and over a dozen senior Venezuelan officials on charges of narco-terrorism. The indictment alleges that Maduro and his inner circle conspired with Colombian dissident groups to flood the United States with cocaine, and there's now a $50 million bounty on Maduro's head. By accusing Venezuelan military officers of being members of a drug trafficking cartel, and then designating that cartel as a foreign terrorist organization, Washington has created the framework where any engagement with Venezuela's armed forces can be classified as counter-terrorism. The entire state apparatus becomes a legitimate target. And this is how you get from a counter-narcotics operation to a ground invasion without ever declaring war. The FTO designation, combined with the existing indictments, gives the Trump administration the legal cover to send troops onto Venezuelan soil under the banner of law enforcement. When Trump says, quote, "the land is easier," this is the framework that makes it possible. There's just one problem with the narrative. The DEA estimated in 2020 that 74% of the cocaine entering the United States travels through the Pacific, and the State Department's own figures show most Venezuelan cocaine goes to Europe or Brazil. And the New York Times reports that military officers have confirmed no cocaine was found on the boats that they targeted. A toddler could see through the drug war story. So, what's actually driving this? Here's a clue. It's 300 billion barrels heavy. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, the bulk of which sits in the Orinoco Belt, a vast deposit of extra heavy crude running along the northern bank of the Orinoco River. Extra heavy crude is thick, sulfurous, and requires specialized refining infrastructure to process. As it so happens, the US Gulf Coast refinery complex is specifically tooled for exactly this kind of feedstock, a legacy of decades of Venezuelan imports before the US actually sanctioned them. Ever since then, American refiners have had to source less optimal crude elsewhere or pay premiums for Canadian bitumen. It works, but it's not ideal. Now, you don't have to take my word for it that this is all about oil. Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, America's closest ally in the region, gave an interview on CNN this week. His summary of the situation was blunt. Quote, "Oil is at the heart of the matter. That's a negotiation about oil. He's not thinking about the democratization of Venezuela, let alone the narco-trafficking." Now, for context, under former President Hugo Chavez, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry and used the revenues to fund social programs and pay down foreign debt. And this did not go over well in Washington or on Wall Street. A Venezuela that controls its own oil and sells it to whomever it likes, increasingly to China to service foreign loans from Beijing, is unacceptable to Washington. US military intervention in Venezuela is a throwback to the Monroe Doctrine, which posits that the entire Western Hemisphere is the United States' backyard. Funnily enough, this doctrine began as a defensive posture. 200 years ago, President James Monroe declared that the Western Hemisphere, the so-called New World, was off-limits to the European colonial powers. And it was this hands-off doctrine that led President Roosevelt to send the US Navy to the coast of Venezuela in 1902, not to invade, but to repel British and German ships that were attempting a blockade of the country. But the Monroe Doctrine also implied a US claim to hegemony over the entire continent and the disregard for the sovereignty of Latin American nation-states. Before long, Monroe became a justification for US military intervention anywhere in the Americas, anytime Washington saw fit. The doctrine fell out of rhetorical fashion after the Cold War, although coups were still in. The Obama administration preferred to talk about partnerships in Central and South America, even while backing a coup in Honduras and pulling one off in Haiti. But in recent years, the mask has come off again. It's Monroe loud and proud, and Venezuela is the main course. This time, the issue isn't only about oil, though. It's also about who Venezuela is doing business with. China has poured billions into Venezuela through oil-for-loan arrangements. Russia has sent military advisors and conducted joint exercises with Venezuelan forces. From Washington's perspective, this is intolerable. Great power rivals establishing a foothold in America's backyard? The US Southern Command has said as much explicitly, framing the military presence as necessary to counter, quote, malign influence from state actors. And this rather gives the game away. If Western consternation about Venezuela were about human rights or democracy, you'd expect a diplomatic avenue to remain open. But if it's about preventing Latin American countries from forming alliances with Russia or China, then the continued existence of the Chavista government in Venezuela is less a matter for diplomacy and more a thorn to be removed. Which brings us to how Washington has been trying to remove it. Before the carrier groups and the strike missions, there were sanctions. Comprehensive, suffocating sanctions targeting Venezuela's access to international financial markets, its publicly owned oil company, PDVSA, and its central bank. The explicit goal was to suffocate the economy until the government collapsed or the military switched sides. Neither happened, but the sanctions did help cause a humanitarian catastrophe. A 2019 study by the Center for Economic and Policy Research estimated that the US sanctions were responsible for over 40,000 Venezuelan deaths between 2017 and 2018 alone. By cutting off the revenue stream from all exports, the sanctions decimated the country's ability to import food and medicine. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies, malnutrition spiked, and millions fled the country. Now, let's be clear, the socialist policies of the Chavez and Maduro governments haven't helped Venezuela and its people either. But walling off the country from the rest of the global economy has tightened the screws significantly. Now, crippling sanctions like those imposed on Venezuela rarely accomplish their explicit goals, but they are effective for manufacturing international consent for military intervention. It's a closed loop. Sanctions cause the crisis, and the crisis justifies the invasion. It's the oldest trick in the book, or manual, I should say. This exact strategy was recommended in the CIA's Psychological Warfare Manual for the 1954 coup in Guatemala. But Venezuela is a textbook case where the economic pressure failed to dislodge the government. Coup attempts in 2002 and 2019 failed. The next logical step for Washington was a direct military intervention to get the job done once and for all. The market is already pricing this in. Venezuelan sovereign bonds, which have been in default and trading for pennies, have rallied at least 80% this year. Major financial institutions like Citi are issuing reports suggesting that if the regime change occurs, these bonds could recover to, quote, mid-40 cents on the dollar. This is the regime change trade. Wall Street is putting its money where the missiles are and betting on the success of the US military. Their hope is that a new US-friendly government will privatize PDVSA, Venezuela's publicly owned oil company, and slash government spending to pay back international creditors. Speaking of trading, if you're active in the markets, why not position yourself ahead of the curve by signing up for our weekly newsletter? And while you're at it, you can take advantage of the finance-related deals we have for our loyal viewers. Simply click the link in the description below or scan this QR code and it'll take you right to our deals and sign-up page. The newsletter is absolutely free and the deals we have are exclusively for the viewers of this channel. These include numerous bonuses, discounts, and promotions. So check it out now. And now, back to the video. Now, every military intervention in a foreign country requires a political cover. And as usual, the legitimization of a parallel government is a key part of the strategy in Venezuela. Washington's previous candidate was former opposition leader Juan Guaido. After Maduro's inauguration in 2019, Guaido declared himself president, calling upon the Venezuelan public and military to rise up and join him in, quote, the greatest march in history to oust the government. The US, Canada, the UK, and the European Union recognized Guaido as president and even handed over control over some of Venezuelan state assets held in their banks. But neither military uprising nor the greatest march materialized, and despite vocal support from Western governments, Guaido went precisely nowhere. Now, they're not going to let that happen again. This time around, Maria Corina Machado has been awarded the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize for her opposition to the Maduro government. And this has elevated her from a domestic political figure to a global icon for democracy and a leader-in-waiting of a transition government. It provides a ready-made casus belli if the Maduro government moves against her. and it reframes the entire conflict, no longer the United States versus Venezuela, but a mission to protect a Peace Prize laureate from a narco-dictator. Machado's credentials as a US ally are spotless. Her organization was funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, the federally funded NGO, whose role was described by its architect Alan Weinstein in 1991 as doing in broad daylight, quote, what was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. Machado took part in the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez, signing a decree to dissolve the country's democratic institutions, and she met with President George W. Bush in 2005. Her platform today aligns perfectly with Washington's wish list. She wants to expel Russian and Cuban influence from the country, privatize PDVSA, and reopen the sector to foreign investors. In her words, American corporations will, quote, make a lot of money. ExxonMobil and Chevron, who lost their Venezuelan concessions under Chavez, would presumably be first in line. We are also seeing a familiar pattern regarding peace offers. There are reports circulating that the Maduro government, realizing the threat is existential, has made back-channel offers to the US, potentially involving oil concessions or distancing from geopolitical rivals like Russia and China in exchange for survival. And these are being rejected or ignored. And this looks like a rerun of the lead-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. In the final weeks before the invasion, Saddam Hussein used intermediaries to offer the US sweeping concessions, allowing FBI agents to search for WMDs, holding elections within 2 years, and giving US companies priority oil contracts. The Bush administration refused to take yes for an answer and instead suppressed news of these offers because disarmament was never the goal, regime change was. And we saw it again in Libya in 2011, where Gaddafi accepted an African Union peace plan, but NATO continued bombing because the political objective was his removal. The rejection of the off-ramps is the clearest indicator that the decision to escalate has already been made in Washington. The whole point of the narco-terrorist is an irredeemable villainous figure who cannot be negotiated with and must be eliminated. And if you want to find out what happens next, the US invasion of Panama in 1989 shares many parallels with the present. That year, the US indicted Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega on drug trafficking charges, rather like the narco-terrorism label slapped on Maduro's government. The US built up forces in the Panama Canal zone under the guise of routine maneuvers, much like the build-up of the forces today under the guise of counter-narcotics operations. In 1989, the US claimed it was acting to protect American lives and restore democracy. Today, the imperative is to protect Peace Prize laureate and opposition leader Machado, which serves the same function. The rally we see in Venezuelan government bonds is also something we've seen before. Before the 2003 Iraq invasion, markets began to price in the post-Saddam era. Upon invading Panama, the US immediately lifted sanctions and provided aid packages once the new government was installed, allowing debt servicing to resume. So, in the near term, there are a few likely scenarios. The US could impose a total naval blockade under the pretext of stopping drug trafficking, and this would choke off all of Venezuela's oil exports to China and prevent fuel imports, bringing the country to a complete halt within weeks. And this is a high-risk move that could potentially provoke a confrontation with Russian or Chinese vessels. Alternatively, they could go for the Panama model with a decapitation strike, and this would be a sudden, overwhelming air and missile campaign targeting command and control centers, air defenses, and the leadership circle, likely aimed at killing Maduro and members of the government and military, but inevitably killing a lot of civilians too. The military hardware posted offshore suggests the capability for this is already in place. A third scenario is an internal coup, where US aggression escalates with the intention of forcing the Venezuelan military to remove Maduro themselves to avoid the destruction of a decapitation strike. The US may be offering amnesty or financial incentives to generals who switch sides, a tactic used extensively in 2003 in Iraq. Remember, though, that the internal coup attempts in Venezuela failed in 2002 and 2019, and in the latter case, the refusal of military offers to defect guaranteed the coup never materialized. One more thing to be on the lookout for is any security incident in the Caribbean in the coming days. A harassed US ship or a drone incursion could easily serve as the Gulf of Tonkin-style excuse to invade. The situation is tense and likely to have escalated by the time you're watching this video. Hopefully, cooler heads will prevail, but I wouldn't bet on it. Keep an eye out on those Venezuelan bonds for an indication of what the markets expect to happen. And if you want to distract yourself from all the doom and gloom, why not watch this video about the much more peaceful battle between New York and Texas for the home of finance in the US. That's all from me now. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.